Chapter 1. Introduction. A dark entertainment. Imagine a world without television, the internet, or social media. No movies to stream, no concerts to attend, no football matches to cheer for. In medieval and early modern societies, people still needed something to stimulate their senses, to feel connected, and to escape their daily routines. But instead of entertainment, as we know it today, they turned to something far more disturbing: public torture and executions. These were not underground, secret punishments. In fact, they were highly anticipated public events, often announced days or even weeks in advance. Entire towns would gather in large open squares, not out of fear but out of fascination. For many, this was a day out, an occasion to be social, to bring children, and to be part of the spectacle. From the beheadings in Tudor England to burnings in Spain. From floggings in colonial towns to the infamous guillotine during the French Revolution, violence was staged like theater. Execution platforms were built high so everyone could see. People sold food and drinks nearby. In some cities, taverns even opened special windows that gave a better view of the punishment. Even more unsettling, these events weren't spontaneous acts of justice. They were deliberately marketed and organized with a time, a place, and, often, a dramatic script. Governments and religious institutions used them to send strong messages. Disobey the law or the church, and this could happen to you. And the public, rather than rejecting this cruelty, often celebrated it. Today, this may seem barbaric, but to fully understand the psychology of a crowd and how suffering became a form of entertainment, we must first explore how deeply rooted this practice was in human history, and how it was intentionally promoted by those in power. In the following chapters, we'll explore how these torture events were organized, advertised, and consumed not just as punishments, but as public performances. Chapter 2. The purpose behind public torture: power, fear, and control. Public torture wasn't just about punishing a criminal, it was a tool of statecraft, a performance of power. Rulers, monarchs, and religious authorities used these events to send a crystal clear message to the public. This is what happens when you defy us. In an age where few could read, where newspapers and mass media didn't exist, the most effective way to communicate authority was through spectacles, something that could be seen, heard, and remembered by thousands. At once, these punishments were rarely random or rushed. They were meticulously choreographed. The location was chosen for visibility, the timing carefully planned, and even the method of torture selected based on the message it needed to convey. A thief might lose a hand, a heretic might be burned alive, a traitor might be broken on the wheel in front of a cheering crowd. Every act had symbolic weight. It wasn't just about the person being punished, it was about the crowd watching. The state wanted to instill fear, to warn others through the suffering of one. And yet, paradoxically, these events often provided the masses with a twisted form of reassurance. As long as they obeyed the rules, they were safe. The boundary between law and chaos was being visibly reinforced. Some executions even began with public confessions, speeches from clergy, or proclamations from officials. These were not just punishments, they were public rituals, designed to maintain order, enforce ideology, and reinforce loyalty to the ruling powers. Chapter 3. The role of the crowd. Spectators of suffering. It's easy to imagine crowds as silent witnesses to violence, but in reality, they were anything but passive. The public played a central role in the success of these spectacles. Their reactions, gasps, cheers, jeers, and even laughter energized the event. For many, the day of a public torture or execution was a major occasion. People traveled from nearby villages, families gathered early to secure good viewing spots, and vendors sold roasted meats, pastries, and ale. It was part punishment, part festival. Children were often brought along, not just as bystanders, but as intended moral students. Parents believed witnessing such acts would teach obedience and respect for authority. Teachers even encouraged students to attend as part of their civic education. The reactions of the crowd could range from morbid fascination to wild enthusiasm. In some cities, if the execution wasn't brutal enough, people would boo. There are historical accounts of crowds demanding more pain, more blood, and more spectacle. In this way, the audience didn't just watch, they participated emotionally, socially, and sometimes even physically. Over time, public torture became something the people expected. They discussed upcoming executions like modern audiences talk about concerts or movies. Executioners, in turn, knew they were performing not just for justice but for the approval of the masses. This collective psychology, the merging of fear, entertainment, and ritual gave public torture its strange power. It was not just an act of violence, but a carefully managed performance staged for society. By society. Chapter 4. Marketing the event, turning pain into publicity, ***, in an era long before billboards or social media. Even acts of brutal justice needed promotion. In medieval and early modern Europe, the announcement of a public torture or execution was not a secret. In fact, it was loudly and widely publicized to ensure a large audience. Town criers, Messengers employed by the state would walk through streets, ringing bells or blowing horns, shouting the date, time, location, and even the name of the condemned. It was, in every sense, a public campaign. Public squares, church notice boards, and market corners displayed handwritten notices or woodcut posters. These advertisements weren't just informative, they were dramatic. Some even contained illustrations depicting the crime or the punishment to come. The more notorious the criminal, the more dramatic the advertisement. Criminals who had committed shocking or political crimes became local celebrities. Even in disgrace, their stories spread through rumors, songs, and public readings. In many cases, people didn't come just to witness punishment, they came to see a story conclude. The crowd followed the drama from arrest to trial to execution. Like a modern-day courtroom series, executioners, too, were part of this strange economy of spectacle. Far from anonymous, many were public personalities in their own right. Some were feared, others oddly admired. In large cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg, executioners were regular figures in public life, and skilled ones were known by name. This strange form of marketing turned suffering into something timed, curated, and commodified. The authorities knew that fear alone wouldn't fill the square, anticipation and curiosity would, and so they crafted each event like a public performance. Chapter 5. The most infamous methods. Theater of pain. Not all torture methods were created equal. Some were designed not only to punish but to hold an audience's attention. Among the most notorious tools of public torment was the rack, a device that slowly stretched a victim's body until joints dislocated and bones cracked. While it was often used privately during interrogations, its effects were sometimes described publicly to increase fear. Then there was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, gruesome device on which the victim's limbs were systematically shattered with a hammer or iron bar while tied to a wooden wheel. In some cases, the body was left on display for days, a morbid warning post to anyone considering rebellion. Perhaps the most symbolically powerful was burning at the stake, used frequently for heretics and those accused of witchcraft. It was often performed in open squares where thousands gathered. The act itself was deeply ritualized, with processions, prayers, and public confessions. The fire was as much a tool of purification as it was of pain, at least in the eyes of the church. Other methods included drawing and quartering used for traitors in England, flogging, branding, ear cropping, and amputation. All of these were visual, visceral, and meant to last in the memory of those watching. These punishments were rarely swift. In fact, they were often deliberately drawn out. The intention was not just to inflict pain, but to hold attention, to make every minute a reminder of the state's power and the individual's helplessness. In the modern world, where films and series depict violence through special effects, it can be easy to forget that real people once watched real suffering in real time and considered it not just acceptable but necessary. In the next chapter, we'll explore how these events were often framed as moral and religious duties, giving brutality the illusion of virtue. Chapter 6. Religious and moral justification, sin, salvation, and suffering. In the medieval and early modern worlds, punishment was not just legal, it was spiritual. The church played a central role in everyday life, and its influence extended deep into the justice system. Torture and execution weren't just allowed, they were often sanctified. Criminals weren't merely lawbreakers, they were often seen as sinners whose actions threatened the moral order of society. Therefore, punishing them wasn't just about justice, it was about purification. Public torture and execution were framed as a form of penance not only for the condemned, but for the entire community. When someone was burned at the stake for heresy, it wasn't just a violent death. It was, in the eyes of the church, the cleansing of a soul through fire. Crowds were encouraged to pray, to reflect, to witness divine justice in action. Clergy were present at most executions. They would read out loud from religious texts, offer the condemned a final chance to repent, and remind the crowd that this punishment was ordained by God. Sometimes sermons were delivered before or after the execution, turning the entire event into a kind of spiritual theater. Even the instruments of torture were seen through this lens. The flames that consumed heretics symbolized hell. The wheel that crushed a traitor's body was likened to divine retribution. Pain was not only punishment, it was a reminder of eternal damnation, used to keep society in spiritual alignment. Over time, however, the line between moral lesson and public spectacle began to blur. People attended these events not only to reflect on their sins, but to enjoy the drama. Laughter, cheering, and even vendors selling snacks began to mix with prayers and scripture. The contradiction was clear, but few questioned it. By wrapping violence in sacred language, both church and state ensured that the people not only accepted cruelty, they saw it as necessary for salvation. Chapter 7. Torture as political theater. Power on display. While many public punishments claimed religious or moral justification, others were unmistakably political. Torture, when used strategically, became a tool of spectacle-driven control. A public stage. where power could be demonstrated in its rawest form. Rulers didn't just punish petty criminals in the public square, they often reserved the most theatrical tortures for rebels, traitors, and political dissidents. These were not random acts of violence. They were public warnings. Consider the fate of rebels in feudal Europe or revolutionaries in colonial empires. Their executions were often long, symbolic, and heavily choreographed. They were brought to central squares, flanked by soldiers, beneath the flags and banners of the ruling regime. Official proclamations were read aloud, declaring the condemned guilty of crimes against the crown, the people, or the divine order. Sometimes, these events began with public trials or ritual confessions, where the accused, often under duress, made to admit guilt and plead for forgiveness. The crowd wasn't just watching justice, they were watching a performance of authority. From the French Revolution's guillotine stage to the scaffolded hangings in Renaissance Italy. These public events were designed to dismantle the image of the rebel and replace it with one of order restored. The presence of marching troops, coordinated announcements, and even celebratory music was meant to reinforce the image of a strong, unified state. Even architecture played a role. In many cities, the main square where executions took place was surrounded by churches, government buildings, and statues of kings. The location itself became a symbolic message. This is the heart of power, and here is where disobedience ends. The deeper message was simple but effective. Look what happens. To those who challenge the system, public torture, in this sense, was not just punishment, it was political theater, crafted to shape opinion, enforce obedience, and silence dissent. Chapter 8. The Executioner's Fame. The celebrity behind the mask. In many cities across Europe, executioners occupied a strange and paradoxical position in society. Despite their gruesome profession, they were often well-known public figures, even minor celebrities in their own right. People didn't just know the names of famous criminals. They also recognized the executioners who carried out the sentences. These men executioners were almost always men held a unique place. They were both feared and oddly respected. Their job was to enforce justice, but also to entertain. And in some cases, their skill and style were appreciated by the crowds. In bustling cities like Paris, London, and Rome, large crowds gathered regularly for public executions, especially when the condemned was famous or notorious. Executioners sometimes earned extra money by prolonging the suffering, applying the torture method more slowly or theatrically, to heighten the drama and satisfy the crowd's morbid curiosity. Historical records mention executioners who developed reputations for either merciless efficiency or for being cruelly meticulous, and sometimes even for moments of unexpected mercy. Their reputations would spread by word of mouth, making their presence a key part of the event's draw. In some places, executioners' families lived separately from the general population due to social stigma, yet paradoxically, their work made them indispensable, and their names were etched in the public consciousness alongside those of kings and criminals. This strange celebrity status shows how deeply intertwined public punishment and social spectacle had become. Executioners were not mere functionaries, they were actors on a stage, performing a dark ritual before an eager audience. Chapter 9. When the public turned against it. The end of an era as the world moved into the 18th and 19th centuries. Profound changes began to reshape societies, politics, and ideas about justice and human dignity. The Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire challenged the cruelty and inefficiency of torture and public executions. They argued that justice should be humane, rational, and private, not a public spectacle of suffering. Writers, artists, and early human rights activists began to publicly criticize these brutal practices, calling them barbaric and unnecessary. The idea that punishment should aim at reform rather than revenge took hold. Prisons replaced public squares as places of punishment, and torture instruments were locked away. Public attitudes also shifted. Crowds began to view executions less as entertainment and more as disturbing relics of a cruel past. In some places, attempts to stage public executions were met with protests or reduced attendance. Gradually, governments began to move executions behind closed doors, away from public view, to prisons or private settings. The last public executions in many European countries were held by the late 19th century, marking the end of a dark chapter in human history. This transformation was not just legal, it was cultural and moral. It reflected a growing respect for human rights and the value of dignity, even in punishment. Chapter 10. Reflection. Why it still matters though centuries have passed since the days of public torture. The legacy of these brutal spectacles continues to echo in modern culture. Today, we no longer gather in town squares to watch pain inflicted on others, but many of us still consume violence as a form of entertainment. From blockbuster movies and graphic video games to popular true crime documentaries and sensational news coverage, our society remains fascinated by human suffering, conflict, and punishment. The psychology behind this fascination, what draws people to watch pain and cruelty, has deep historical roots. stretching back to those dark public events. Understanding the history of public torture is not simply an academic exercise. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, society, and the ways power can manipulate fear and spectacle for control. By studying how torture events were marketed, staged, and consumed, we gain insight into the dangerous allure of spectacle-driven violence. We learn how isolated entertainment can slip into exploitation, and how collective fear can be used to silence dissent and justify cruelty. This reflection also serves as a warning. In a world saturated with violent imagery often framed as just entertainment, we must be vigilant about where the line is drawn. Are we watching to understand, empathize, and learn? Or are we, consciously or unconsciously, participating in a modern form of spectacle, where real pain is commodified and normalized? Ultimately, this history challenges us to seek more humane ways to engage with justice, conflict, and storytelling. It reminds us that while human fascination with suffering may be timeless, our responsibility is to ensure it never again becomes a tool of oppression or cruelty.